Thank you. So it's wonderful to be here moderating this session. Most people tell me I'm a terrible cocktail conversationalist because I always talk about waste. But this is a great book. I would read it. It gives a wonderful perspective, a cross-cultural perspective of the problem. And sometimes when we need to look at ourselves, it's good to look from outside to get over our own biases in some ways. So every book has an origin story. And I would ask, it's always good to understand why someone wrote the book. So with that, can I ask Assi?
Yeah, sure. The book itself came out of a previous book, as things go. Robin and I collaborated on a book called The Great Indian Phone Book, or in India they didn't like the name, they published it under the name Cell Phone Nation. And in part of that book, we decided to really understand how the impact of the mobile phone on Indian society, on Indian social relations, on culture. But one of the chapters that we actually investigated was the infrastructure for rendering the mobile phone so popular in India. There's nothing given about the mobile phone taking off in India, especially when you have so many people with limiting purchasing power. They can't abide by the kind of planned obsolescence, fashion obsolescence that the more affluent people do. I mean, if a mobile phone has a lifespan in the so-called West of 16, 15 months until we change it, in India, many people who don't have that purchasing power would need to actually revive their mobile phone in some way. And I'm sure many of you saw those holes in the walls where people repair the mobile, they tweak it, they put new parts, they revive it, they reincarnate the mobile. And I went to Gafar Market at some point and looked at this whole repair economy, all the mysteries that repair the mobile phones and what they do. And then I also learned that there's also a lot of dead mobile phones. Actually, now there's almost 1 billion. What happens to all these dead mobile phones? Where do they go? What is their trajectory? And what I saw was someone going around the market, these gray markets, and collecting these dead phones and taking them with him. And I started walking around with him and seeing where he takes it. And I realized it was near the Jama Masjid in New Delhi, and then it went to Moradabad, and another area in Delhi called Shilampur. And I continued to go and look, and I realized that actually these mobile phones are then stripped of their constituent parts, and they're recycled, whether it's for the gold or the copper or the silver, and the plastics. They're cooked in acid, and these are very hazardous processes that the people who live in the slums, in these deprived communities, they take our mobile phones and take whatever value you can extract from these dead mobile phones. And I came to Robin and I said, look, there's a burgeoning economy here of electronic waste in India, and nobody's written about this. We need to really look at this, and I kind of tried to convince him to write a book. And it began with electronic waste, which we have a section of in this book on, but it expanded into a wider.
Well, I think so that we're not accused of false advertising, we need to come to the tag we put in the title about teeth and toothbrushes and toothpaste. Assi's talked about what goes with a modern consumer society, a middle-class society at the higher tech end, the mobile phone end. But of course, it's the humble toothbrush that is, according to an American survey done about 10 years ago by the Pew Foundation, they found that the most cherished item for Americans was not their cars, but their toothpaste and their toothbrushes. That their dental hygiene came even before their automobile hygiene. And I think in some ways that's probably true of India. So what we've found in the toothbrush and toothpaste tubes are one of the enemies of a clean and tidy nation. And these sorts of, if we can get us, there we are. These are, what you see on the screen are some of the early endeavors with commercialized tooth care and maintenance. This one, 1879, when the British were importing tooth powders in nice little glass bottles. the arrival of new toilet requisites. If we hurry down to Esplanade Road in Mumbai today, we might still pick up a pot of tooth powder. Although 1887, there might not be any left. Of course, what goes with this kind of commercialization of regular household items are the commercial promotion of things we really don't need at all. Cures for bad breath. This is part of, I think, a famous story in marketing. If some of you are in the marketing and fast-moving consumer goods line, you will, I'm sure, have heard of it. There was a product which was came to be called Listerine, but it was a product of a pharmaceutical company which in the 1920s had a lot of this stuff as a result of the First World War, where it was used as a disinfectant for military wounds. After the war, they knew how to make it. They had quantities of it, so they tried creating a demand for people to cure their bad breath, and they gave it a name, halitosis. And within a few years, they had quadrupled the turnover of the company actually making this material. But in doing it, of course, they were creating more bottles, more labels, more caps that had to be thrown away and dealt with. And of course, in India, toothbrushes and toothpaste still aren't essential, I think, for large numbers of people in the population. Certainly 25 years ago, as far as the figures go, Australia, with a tiny little population of about 18 million, maybe 2 crores at most, was using more toothpaste than the whole of India at that stage. Mind you, Australians may have been a bit, expansive in their use of toothpaste, but nevertheless, good Australian or good Indian marketers and pharmaceutical companies have changed that, of course, and the humble neem twig is on the retreat. And we have the design evolution of the toothpaste tube. And why toothpaste tubes are particularly pernicious for waste removal is that they're made of compounds which have to be taken apart if they're ever to be recycled in some way. So every toothpaste tube represents something that, unless it's treated very carefully, will hang around in rubbish dumps and landfills and in the streets and sewers for a very long time. You get a little bit of a sense of the magnitude from the figures on the screen and the different kinds of Indian toothpastes that are now available. We have our own brand in Dantkandi competing with the great multinationals. So the point, I think, is that the end of life of toothpastes and toothbrushes complicates the recycling economy and the public sanitation economy. And the only people who have so far been able to, good question, can you? Yes. This is a company in Gujarat which is recycling old toothpaste tubes and making a very nice hardboard out of it. But it's a labor-intensive task, and it still hasn't been mass-produced. So I'm sorry, but that's a long-winded way of trying to satisfy the advertisers of our session by emphasizing the toothpaste aspect. But it's also a way of showing, I think, how tiny little things that are consumed in vast quantities now and marketed so strongly by the pharmaceutical companies complicates the cleaning up, the creation of a Swachh Bharat, because these things don't go away, they clog sewers and drains and so on.
So there is one juxtaposition which I found interesting, and I'm going to tie it in. I don't know if any of you went to the Rajendra Singh session. And, there is always this thing of pakka and kacha, right? Indigenous knowledge, we see is treated as inferior to something that comes from outside. We saw it in Rajendra Singh's session of canals being superior to cascading tank systems, which India had. You highlighted it here in terms of the toothpaste being better than the neem twig. But again, you say, we had a perfectly, the neem twig had no end-of-life issues. You just put it down, it became great an additive to the soil. And by chewing on it, you just made it more accessible to the soil. What's your take on it? I mean, why are people not thinking today? The circular economy has become a very popular word, but what do we, I mean, people in this room who are customers of products and corporates need to do to incorporate design thinking and end of life into product design? What do customers need to do? Because everyone here is a customer of some product. And what do corporates need to do? And why are they not doing it already?
Well, the story, of course, always is that the customer is king, and that if customers reject a product, then the product will not be made. But I think toothbrushes and toothpaste are terribly powerful items to manufacture. And there's been nearly 100 years of very strong advertising about dental health, dental hygiene. And just as you say, the perception that this kind of advertising has created, that this is better than what lay before. The neem, I think, was a very effective. The neem and the tongue scrape, I think, account for why rural India has had, with all its health problems in some areas, has had remarkably good dental health, I think. I'm not sure whether people here who have a better knowledge than I do of that, but it's the cursory figures I've seen are that rural India always had, or in recent times, has shown better dental health than rural China, for example, where the tongue scraper and the neem twig don't seem to be part of rural tradition.
And I think that what's interesting about these consumer goods is that it's also changing social relations. So the neem twig was generally used in public spaces. People used to spit. It's something of a kind of an outward way of grooming yourself, just like with the barbers in India. And this has implications for purity and pollution. I mean, the barbers always belong to the low castes. They're the receptacles of pollution, right? They take your pollution, whether it's through malish or whether it's through shaving or whatever, and they contain it for those who come to be groomed. Now, what happens when you move into the household and all these things that come out of you, whether it's hair or saliva, they need to be contained within the household, right? Consumer goods encourage us to move within the household and enjoy these. And this is through the power of these kind of advertising mechanisms, the fast mover consumer goods, we spoke about it yesterday, that India is saturated with all these new grooming techniques, from shampoo to laundry powder to Maggi noodles, right?
So just going back, what would you say people here can do to influence packaging design?
Well, I think...
Can they do anything?
The toothpaste tube is not a bad example, because as the slide, I think, that's up on the screen at the moment, of this rather nice particle board that's being made in Gujarat, to take a toothpaste tube and deconstruct it is labor intensive. And I think that's one of the advantages that India has in the recycling, reuse economy, that the labor is available to take things apart so that their constituent parts can be used in other ways. So that's one element, is ways of encouraging this. The other, of course, the other policy measure that's often suggested is that the producer should pay for the cleanup. So every tube of toothpaste should have a 5 rupee bounty when it's returned empty to Hindustan Lever or whatever the company is. That would be a policy measure for trying to ensure that these things don't end up in landfill or in drains or simply cluttering the streets.
Yeah, I think, we tend to underestimate our own role in influencing the situation, and it's important to understand that we can. And companies don't like bad press, and they like demand. So if you get one person to crack, they will all move forward. So I want to touch briefly on something you brought up, the element of caste. And one of the things I really found fascinating about the book is about attitudes about waste. And there's no getting away from it. The caste system is entrenched in India. And, they talk very nicely in their book on the peculiar aspects in which it influences waste management in India. And it would be wonderful if you can tell us what are the aspects that, of the caste system that really, the one or two things that really impedes or impacts effective waste management in India. And in waste management, let's talk about solid waste management separately and then sewage treatment separately.
I think India, in achieving a Swachh Bharat, which I think is an admirable goal, but in achieving that, I think India has two obstacles that are almost unique to this country. One is the population density. In just raw statistical terms, the population density of India is 2.5 times greater than that of China. We think of China as the most populous country in the world, but India is the most densely populated, with the exception of Bangladesh, major country in the world. Now that means there's not a lot of space to put things in, so the more waste that accumulates, the greater the problems, the intensity of the problem. Now that's something that no other country except Bangladesh faces, and Bangladesh doesn't have the productive capacity of India. The other unique aspect of India's dilemma is, I think, caste, the visceral revulsion that goes beyond simply public sanitation, that many households feel, and many business premises, many public spaces feel towards anything that in some way is tainted. Tainted ritually, tainted in the mind rather than in hygienic sense. Now those two things together, I think, give India a unique set of problems. Now, Assa is much more, I'm the historian and kind of politics student. Assa is the anthropologist who's worked with a lot of different people in India over the last 20 years. And he can elaborate a little bit more on just how this caste element seems to impinge on the way in which waste can be managed, the potential of managing waste.
I think one thing that, as an anthropologist, you're kind of sensitive to the language that people use in the social relations, especially relations of exchange. And I'm sure that many of you in this room know about how people in India name their children in certain ways. And the people that I worked with, which are very low caste, they belong to the Shudras or the Dalits. For example, I was working for some time in Banaras, and I learned that a friend of mine, he was known as Kachra, or in Banarasi Boli is Kataru. And I was asking him, why that name? Who gave you that name? And he said, well, ask my mother. It means rubbish. And I went to see his mother, and I asked, and she said, well, look, I lost a few kids beforehand, before the age of 5, from diarrhea, dehydration, or diseases that I didn't even know about. And I was advised that it's best that I actually do something about this. And what she did is she took her child that was born and put them on the rubbish heap, right? And on the rubbish heap, the woman who is charged with cleaning the rubbish heap is a Dalit, a Chamarin, that belongs to the Chamar caste, right? She took the child and then sold it back to the mother for a symbolic price. And since then, he's known as Kataru, right? Rubbish. So what you think about is that the idea of rubbish is a powerful one. It's almost like a prophylactic. It shielded him. He's now in his 30s. And now he's alive. He was called rubbish. He was shielded from the gods that wouldn't take him because he belongs to a Dalit caste. So this is also social relations. So even people within the lower strata of society articulate ideas about rubbish, about pollution, through these exchange relations, that you give that to the Chamarin, to the person of the Chamar caste. And of course, in everyday life, you look around you, the majority of people who deal with rubbish, who deal with waste, are Dalits.
But that's clearly something that, when we were speaking to an audience yesterday, people were interested in this aspect, and it may be something that you would like to come back to in a question and answer or observation session later. And it would be interesting to inform the discussion with some of that audience reaction, I think. But that I think is our. But what about you, Mridula? Does that answer your question?
To some extent, I mean, in our study, we found cultural associations with waste. The fact that waste is impure and people didn't want to have it in their houses after 6 p.m. posed a huge littering aspect, because the corporation, when it collects waste in the morning. And if you think waste is impure and you don't want to keep it in your house after 6, it goes and sits on an empty plot. So, those cultural associations I found, and Because if people think of waste as something that a particular caste should do, and the fact that I don't see a waste management solution without people doing segregation in their own homes, if they are those two ideas in opposition to each other? Like, I won't manage my waste because I'm not from that caste, that's somebody else's job. But if that, and I don't see waste ever being solved in India if you don't manage your own waste, at least segregating.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the future, not just in India, but in all urbanizing societies now, as cities become larger and larger, the answer to the best management of public sanitation is a lot of civic responsibility. Now, that's hard to do. It's hard to do in any country. It's particularly hard, I think, in India for the reasons we've just been talking about. But it does come down to being able to minimize what one's consuming, but having minimized it, just as Mridula says, to be separating it in ways that can be collected and managed by people who can make a decent living out of doing that. People who collect different kinds of waste and pass it on to those who will reprocess it in some productive way.
So to that extent, this can we
Yeah,
go to the hair slide? Many of us at birth had our hair taken off, but hair is considered dirty. Many barbers will not cut on a Tuesday or a Friday or a Saturday, depending on where you are. And anyone who touches hair is considered dirty. And do you want to share your story?
Well, I think this also captures the idea of grooming that we spoke about before. We all groom our hair, and this hair that you see here, I was walking around with waste pickers, with what's called also scavengers, and I realized that suddenly they're pulling hair out of the different henna bottles and sandals and chappals and cassette tapes, and they're putting it into a small box there. And I started tracing what's going on with this hair. I've heard of the hair in Tirumala, of course, the GST exempt hair in Tirumala, the multi-million-dollar business, but I haven't heard of the waste hair. And I decided to follow this through, and I then went to the slum next to this place, and they sell it to a Bengali wholesaler. And then he packages it and sends it to either Kolkata or to Delhi. And I wanted to understand what happens to this hair. It's an interesting globalization story of recycling, if you will, but recycling of organic material. And what we see here is once I managed to find the person at the top of the chain, and that's how I think any waste and recycling gains value, you see that this is I went to meet the king of hair in Delhi, and he exports 60 tons of waste hair. Bear in mind, this is not temple hair, this is waste hair, yeah? 60 tons a month of waste hair in his factory, and this is a classic capitalist factory. They strip the hair of its polluting aspects, and they render it a commodity that's then exported to markets, especially in Africa, but also in London and in the United States for wigs. Again, this to my mind really represents the gaining of value of material.
Where are the wigs made? The wigs are made in China. Most of that hair is going to China for the manufacture, which is a pity in a way, because there's a lot of value added in the making of a fine wig, isn't it?
So that's capitalism over caste then, because you said it gets polluting meaning because it has now become a commercial product. I want to get into one aspect which is of such critical importance to India. India is water scarce, and so is Israel. You guys actually get far less rain than we do. And one of the key factors behind your self-sufficiency is treating your sewage. Israel treats 85% of its sewage. And I've been there and I've stood in the desert and seen seas of green of plants growing in the desert fed from treated sewage. Why don't we do it? What can we learn? How do we go about it? Again, lots of stories in this, but would be love.
I think the main point is to remember, and that's what Robin mentioned before, there's a question of scale here. Israel is a very small country. You're able to actually implement these programs in a very meticulous way. There is the ability to tap into the technology and recycle the sewage. In India, what we found in going around in different places is that actually a lot of these sewage treatment plants are a lot of times broken, they're not functioning, or they're not to the standard that you would want.
There was an item many of you will have seen in the Times of India a couple of days ago. Mumbai, I gather from the item in the newspaper, has 8 sewage treatment plants, but 6 of them are not treating the water, the sewage that comes into them at a satisfactory standard. And there's been an inquiry to try to understand this and then to rectify it. The other point to make, sewage treatment plants take up a lot of space, they take a lot of maintenance. Bombay has 8 for a population of probably 2 crores. New York City, with a population of less than 1 crore, has 14. So there's a terrible difference in capacity at the moment, certainly in a city like Mumbai, in dealing with one of these operations. But
because of your specialization in politics, one of the amendments that India has for 25 years and has never pushed it too much is our 74th amendment, which says power should devolve down. And I know there's a chapter in your book on what local bodies should and don't achieve and what they can achieve.
Yes, I mean, a sewage treatment plant, for example, should cover a whole city. I've just had a few days in Kerala, and in Trivandrum, they were, bragging might be the wrong word, but they were very proud of the fact that they have 1 sewage treatment plant working, now taking all the piped sewage of the city, as well as the contents of most of the honeysuckers that suck out so-called septic tanks. And they actually have spare capacity that they can rent out to the sewage systems of neighboring municipal corporations. But that's an unusual state of affairs in India, to have a sewage treatment plant that is working to capacity and capable of dealing with what they get. Local government is such a problem in all these things because the National Capital Territory of Delhi, of course, has 5 different levels of government operating within that really small unit. So to get a joint decision on something as large and expensive as a sewage treatment plant, if you go on a wee bit in the, just come down to that, nearly the end. Just to give an idea, if we can shoot through to, this is a couple more. That's a honeysucker. This is one of the sewage treatment plants at Ahmedabad. But what you can see is the vast area that it takes up to treat sewage effectively, and a great deal of electricity as well. So it takes a unified, either state government initiative or some sort of cooperation amongst municipal authorities to carry off a capital expenditure like this, and then to supply the high-quality engineers needed to keep a plant like this operating constantly, because as soon as it begins to stop, if it fails, then there's a backup, which is very hard to overcome. And in varying conditions, where in monsoon, stormwater drains flow into the sewers, and again you get an overburden on the treatment plant itself. So these are things that require sophisticated and cooperative levels of local government, and that's very, very hard to achieve. Local governments, I think, in India are underpowered. They don't have either the authority or the financial resources to achieve many of the things that are expected of them, and that makes for a difficulty. I know when the 73rd and 74th Amendments were being debated, there were advocates of local government who felt that they hadn't gone far enough. It was very nice to have it enshrined in the Constitution that there shall be local governments. In Australia, local government is not enshrined in any way. A state government could abolish all our local governments if it wished. In India, it's a constitutional thing, so it is a higher level. But I know the critics of what the final outcome in the Constitution, they said we haven't given these bodies enough power to do their work. And consequently, they don't always get the greatest skills in the people they're able to hire or to keep strong people long enough. Too many top engineers might start in local government, learn some skills working in plants like these, and then move into the private sector because they've acquired skills through working and taking advantage of government opportunities.
There is a problem of population exclusion also. That is the problem.
Yeah, we will get into question answers very shortly.
Here, it's almost another 5 minutes.
So shall we
If,
just wrap up or get?
We have a Q&A session.
shall we go to questions then?
Yeah,
Let's do that. I think
That was highly insightful, but I'm sure the audience will need some clarity and thought. So would you like to address your issue first? No. Yes, sir, you were saying something. Yes.
Yes, I think so. Yes, please
Yeah.
do.
I'm giving the opportunity.
The microphone is there.
Yeah. Okay.
Just common rules on questions. Let's keep it a question
Yes.
and a short comment,
Yeah.
not a parallel lecture.
I am,
Thank you.
I am
Thank you.
basically a lecturer and professor.
But we'll keep it to a question now because I'm sure there are
Now,
other
how much time are you giving to me? First tell me.
So we're running short on time,
I'm
so
not able to, I have not succeeded my anger management till now. Please tell me how much time you have given to me.
A minute.
yeah, a minute tops.
How-
A minute per
A
person.
minute.
Yeah.
We all Indians are very much patriotic towards our country, but we are facing the problem of population here. And it is related with the socio-political structure of our country. That is solution. That is the cause and that may be the solution. If we control our population.
Okay. Yes, sir, please. Yes.
And then the lady over there.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ashish Lalka. I'm a life coach, a lawyer, a lot of things.
So could you please be a little loud?
Sure. This is better? So my question was, we were talking about design of the toothpaste and the toothbrush. Would you prefer some sort of legislation that made it compulsory for companies to follow a certain design that would make the things more biodegradable? Because to ask the public here, I mean, to have a public awareness is one thing, but to be able to do that in a meaningful way, it has not really worked so far.
I think, as I was suggesting earlier, I think the policy measure that's adopted in many countries is that you put a bounty on the expended tube, so that the tube becomes, when it's empty and useless, it's worth 5 rupees when you return it to the manufacturer. And the manufacturer has to bear that cost and factor it into their pricing. And that 5 rupees, or whatever figure one puts, is an incentive for waste pickers and kabaris then to collect these
Because
things.
correct me if I'm wrong, but a similar incentive for plastic water bottles has failed. It has not really, I mean, a lot of it gets returned, a lot of it does not. So to overcome that, I was thinking, what are your thoughts if we could maybe have some sort of legislation that would, so then the whole problem of returning it would end. You just have to make sure that it would be biodegradable. And if you worked on something like that, then I could possibly help take it forward and send it to a parliamentary committee or something like that through.
Certainly with plastic bottles, it's a policy in many parts of the world that they do have a bounty. And that does guarantee 80–85% returns because there's a decent return for the collectors. So that's policy that's not all that difficult to implement.
And I think it should be standardized. I mean, like we heard yesterday, there's a fluctuating market for these recyclables, whether it's plastic or iron or brass or what have you. And it needs to be standardized so that it's actually, a beer bottle actually costs, it doesn't go from 5 rupees one month to 1 rupee the other month.
As it is, as Assi's suggesting, though rag pickers will collect bottles of one kind, the price varies according to the market. The policy measure is that a toothpaste tube is worth 5 rupees, regardless of how the market is running for plastic at that particular moment, so that the return is guaranteed to the collector. And that, I think, is a desirable way of handling it.
Thank you.
The next question, please.
Yes,
The
ma'am.
lady over there.
I have a question. I've noticed that a lot of sustainable alternatives to products actually end up being more expensive. And the issue in India is we have a population that can't really afford most products. So how do you incentivize them to kind of opt for a sustainable alternative?
That's a great question, firstly.
Yeah, I think the main thing for a sustainable alternative is to use what you have already and not try to import these things or render them fancy. And there's so many materials in India that are available that you can use in a way that is sustainable. It doesn't necessarily clog the sewage or create a backlog, and that the people who are actually extricating these things know they have a guaranteed income if they're going to recycle things. So it comes back to that question of India runs on an informal market, an informal economy. These are the people who actually, in the unorganized sector, take these recyclable materials, and they need to know that they're protected. They need to know that whatever materials are there won't harm them, and that they're guaranteed a return when they go up to the recycling chain.
There's one thing I'm going to add. See, sustainability till now has been seen as an elitist topic.
Yeah.
So it's catering to that market. If rich people think sustainability is their thing, charge them a lot of money. I think when sustainability achieves scale, you will start seeing cheaper alternatives.
Well said.
One question.
Yes, sir.
Mridula, you mentioned capitalism over caste, and that's a very interesting concept because you often see in India, for example, people who come to households to collect waste. In the old times, they'd look a certain way, people wouldn't bother. But now increasingly you see them being given uniforms and gloves, and the very visual effect it has, it lends a certain amount of dignity, and people respond to that. So clearly, if waste is packaged in a way where the pollution is taken away, people can visually sense that, hold on, there's something changing here. Have you noticed that in your research? The idea that branding waste properly and giving people an impression or a look of dignity helps.
It's interesting you raise that, because it isn't as if India, as a rapidly urbanizing society, was experiencing something entirely new. America and Europe had this rapid urbanization more than 100 years ago. And when they tried to clean up the city of New York for the first time in the 1890s, New York was notorious for its filth. There were pigs running, feral pigs were running through the streets of New York, along with millions of horses being used for transport in the 1890s. Colonel Waring, who was a Civil War veteran, was given the job of trying to clean up New York. And he created the New York Sanitation Service, the San Men, as they're known, I think, even today. San women, San persons, perhaps, today. But nevertheless, one of the things he did was to put all his sanitation workers into clean white uniforms and give it their responsibility to turn up looking respectable for work. And then he backed them with the police force. The police force was ordered to support the sanitation workers in their new dignity in ways that had not been supported before. And in the course of the 1890s, New York became a cleaner city, aided, of course, by the arrival of the automobile, which brought a new kind of pollution to the world, but not pig dung and horse dung lying in the streets. So I think we've seen this in other parts of India where local governments and perhaps NGOs have succeeded in organizing waste pickers, providing them with uniforms, with the proper equipment, and with passes, with identity cards. And those sorts of things terribly important in eliciting respect from citizens and householders, and making the waste picker and the householder and the business owner part of a team, if you like, in keeping their colony or their corner of the city clean.
Manu, that's a really brilliant thought. That is, rebranding waste is so important. I mean, Sangeeta has come home, and when I taught the session this morning, only way to succeed is if waste management is not gross. It doesn't smell, it's pleasant to handle, and it can be. And I think, it's important to reinforce that. Great question.
Yes, sir.
Okay, when it comes to plastic and Tetra Paks, we have the triangles for the recycling which has numbers on it. Now, I ask the department stores, where should I give this, and which kind of recycling trucks are going to receive it, but they don't have any answers. And when we try to email them, there are no responses. The same thing goes with the plastic that has come after the banning of the new old plastics. They mention where to contact and we'll be giving 15 rupees per kilo kind of thing. But I again asked the department stores where I buy it from. No, we don't take them again. And even if I email the people, where is it, and all, I never had any response. So how do we act upon such kind of things?
And you know, the little symbols, the little triangles we see on plastics tell you the kind of plastic and the chemical makeup of that plastic. When it actually comes to recycling, the quality, or keeping all the number 4s with the other number 4s is important in the recycling process. Now that's something that in the most sophisticated waste picking operations in India, the workers know almost at once what the quality of a particular plastic is and can put them into the appropriate bin. But of course, they have to find their way to such a recycling center in the first place. Tetra Paks are, I met an senior Australian waste manager, senior engineer, and when I asked him about Tetra Paks, he said, oh, they're the work of the devil, because they have three bonded materials, paper, plastic, and aluminum in the same package. And they make a wonderful material once you pull them apart. They have valuable materials in them, but they're a terrible thing to pull apart, and they're labor intensive again. But with plastic, it depends on the collection and what the availability of reprocessing technology is in the locality where it's happening. In parts of Calcutta, I've seen shops no bigger than this stage taking plastic bottles in at one end and turning out window brackets, good hard plastic window brackets at the other, through extruding machines and pelletizing before they go into the extruding machine. You know, done in a very at very close quarters. So that kind of thing can happen. I think again it comes down to the producer responsibility. Producers have a responsibility, or should have a responsibility, to take a much larger part in looking after their disposable products when they're done.
Robin, if I can add something to that, there is extended plastic rules in India.
Wonderful plastic.
But we still see a lot of questions like this, and there's a gap.
I think that's one of the formal rules, the solid waste management rules of 2000 revised 2 years ago, are superb. They're in great detail. They tell you exactly how waste should be managed in a great city. And as a very senior waste manager in India has said to us a couple of times, and no municipality in the whole of this country comes within a mile of being able to achieve the standards laid down in these rules, because they're setting a very high bar, but they are a roadmap to managing waste.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? You want to take one more?
One more follow-up question. A lot of times in Mumbai, where we see there's a lot of air pollution, that is because of the waste being burned, 30, 40 miles outside the city. Do we have a solution for that, where, at least, because that's causing double pollution, we're breathing burnt waste. So.
Again, we come to the question of whether you recycle that waste, who you give it to recycle. So when you give it to contractors, all they care is the mass, the weight of waste. That's what they get for bringing that waste into the landfill. So you don't have that army of informal recyclers who siphon off things for gaining value and selling it up the chain. Now, once you dump it in a landfill, it accumulates gases. These gases are very inflammable. And so you get these pockets of flames that come up and burn. I mean, Doron is a classic example. The only, if you want to take, the only take-home point for that is that the smoke from Doron affects everyone, the rich and the poor. So maybe it will galvanize people to do something.
Yeah.
As you, again, I'm sure have read in the newspapers, there's a tendency now for public policy people, politicians and bureaucrats, to very seriously consider incineration. Expensive incinerators based on often on Japanese models as the solution to India's waste problem. And in some cities like Singapore and in Japan and in Northern Europe, incineration works quite well. It reduces the volume of waste and leaves you with what should be a benign ash that you can lose in landfill. But incineration for India is a very difficult prospect and extremely expensive, requiring high maintenance. And if it doesn't work at optimum conditions, then it does, as you say, it spews pollution into the air. If high combustion incinerators are run at the standards achieved in Japan and other places, then the air is probably pretty okay when it comes out of the smokestack. But it has to be maintained, and that I think is very difficult. It also, incinerators need dry waste and they need high calorie waste. Yeah. So monsoon conditions make it much more difficult. You've got to expend energy to dry the waste before the incinerator will accept it. And it also encourages people, of course, to burn plastic and paper, because plastic and paper burn and they disappear that way. Singapore has been very tardy in recycling because it has had a very fine incinerator waste management system. But incinerators encourage waste, I suppose, in that way.
But having said that, incinerators could be used, but it's like giving birth to another problem while solving one, considering we already have an air pollution problem that to a massive extent.
But I mean, just to qualify that, with high combustion incineration, the Japanese and the Northern Europeans have been using a sophisticated technology now for 2 generations, and there seems to be no indication that that's adversely affecting people's health. But if you burn below a certain temperature, that's
okay. Yeah.
Well, then that's when the problems come in with polluting molecules going into the air. So incineration, it's not as if the Singaporeans and the Japanese and the Swedes and the Germans were killing themselves, but they're not killing themselves because they're running a very expensive system at very high standards.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, as somebody who takes a flight, I've been noticing the tendency of even more packaging. It's just unbelievable. And in India, somehow the domestic flights think the more they package, the better the consumer will perceive it. I'm just wondering, is there a way of telling the airline industry that, you know, giving them a signal that this should stop?
I think these things need to be at the level of policy, but also enforcement. I mean, you have in India a lot of really good waste management rules, but there's very few people who can come and enforce them. And given also the fact that in India there are a lot of rules of purity and pollution, when you give someone a plate, a leaf plate was disposable, it was organic. No, and then it was considered juta. It's considered polluted. Nobody else would use it. And in the massive weddings or in the massive rituals or Kumbh Melas or what have you, now they've replaced those with thermocol. And they're doing all these, you know, they're doing mass feedings with these disposable materials, and nobody is there to enforce those rules. And afterwards, and these things are very difficult to recycle, like Robin was saying.
See, it again comes back to Manu's point, you know, the branding of waste. I mean, kacha versus pakka. I mean, you see it in water, you see it in waste. Like the banana leaf, perfectly good solution. We now choose an alternative which creates its own set of problems.
Yeah. One last question, I think. Yes. That's only good, right?
I think the point was that the disposable material itself, in certain situations, I'll give you another example. Israel, where I'm from, is the largest polluting country per capita in terms of these disposable items. And again, it comes to the cultural aspects. In Israel, there's a large community of people who are religious. They conduct a lot of ceremonies. The Sabbath is coming in. They have a lot of rituals. They have large families. And so when Friday comes and Saturday comes, they have elaborate disposable plates and cups, and they just use it every day without even thinking about the kind of ecological implications that the use of these disposable items have.
Yes. So,
in a city like Mumbai, the sewage treatment plant is overworking, it seems. I mean, the capacity of the sewage treatment plant, they are working, more capacity is required. But what do you think? Is it enough to, should it be upgraded right now, or say after 20 years it will be another issue altogether?
It's a very good question, and I'm reminded that recent television on the various cable networks was featuring the fact in the last couple of weeks that the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has put some hundreds of millions of US dollars into trying to devise the perfect toilet. And the perfect toilet, of course, wouldn't be sewered. The perfect toilet would be a standalone, small box, I suppose, which would take human excrement, urine and feces, and somehow contain the human waste and put it in a container that would allow the householder or the business owner to simply remove a clean bag every so often, put it out where it would be collected, removed, and produce good fertilizer at the end of it, without anyone having to hold their nose, without any notion that it would be defiling for a Brahmin or a very Orthodox Israeli Jew to hold this awful material. Now, the Gates Foundation hasn't yet succeeded. There are some lovely models. Assa's got one of them. The one you see on the screen is a South African device. The man who markets these things says there are 20 or 30,000 being used in southern Africa. Very, very nice. They give you a benign fertilizer whenever they need to be cleaned. But as you can see, it's quite a large plastic. You can see the dimensions on the screen. It's quite a large plastic cast. It needs an external vent. It's a complicated item, and it would be no good in a city. It wouldn't work in the city. So can you click one more, Assa? I think there's another one in there. Oh, that's our famous honeysuckers. But if you go back one, maybe we go. Oh, this is the two-pit latrine, which is the mainstay of the Swachh Bharat campaign in rural India, demanding 2 holes in the ground. When one is filled, it's capped, and the other one is used. But someone eventually, of course, has to remove the contents of the hole, which should have matured into a nice, fairly benign fertilizer if it's been properly capped and so on. But again, it's not an easy process, and it's a process that isn't suitable for the city. So I think sewage treatment plants for Mumbai would be so difficult because space is at such a premium on this island. Where would they be put? I suppose the hope would be to expand the existing plants, get them operating at 100% capacity. As I say, the headline in the Times of India a couple of days ago, polluted sewage, 80% of sewage treatment plants still causing pollution, not getting the job done. So.
Yes, and more high-rise buildings are coming up.
Precisely.
It's another addition to the already existing problem.
Yes, indeed. And the way that's resolved at the moment is to pump waste into what is called a septic tank, but they're not septic tanks. They're simply large cesspits, which the honeysucker then has to come and suck out. and should be taking to a sewage treatment plant, but more likely they will be dumping it in the first nullah they can find after dark, illegally doing a very bad thing, but not having to pay the sewage treatment plant for the privilege of unloading and not having the trouble of going there.
Yes, thank you.
Having said that, so we talk about concepts of non-biodegradable and plastic and contamination and even concepts like globalization, which may or may not be conspiracy theories. Do you feel that the generation today is getting lesser and lesser sensitive to these concepts?
I think they're getting more and more sensitive in some part. I've just been in Kerala, where the children in Trivandrum are being indoctrinated in good civic habits of green technologies in a really impressive way. There's an interesting struggle going on, which we talked about yesterday, in the city of Trivandrum, I think, at the moment, between the civic responsibility, individual responsibility method of localized management of wastes, particularly solid wastes, and the vision of many of the senior policymakers, bureaucrats, and engineers of centralized waste management, relying in part at least on incineration. But Trivandrum has 30 wards now, in which responsibility has really been put on the citizens, aided by Safai Karamacharis, but nevertheless the citizen is expected to arrange for their waste to come to little ward-based processing units where there are people on duty to manage that flow, segregate, and also compost, all done locally without having to have 10-ton diesel trucks plowing through the streets, carrying waste to centralized locations. So there's a bit of a contest going on to see which vision of waste management is going to prevail in that city of about 1 million people. So about 1/20th the size of Mumbai, but nevertheless, it would be a powerful example if that city can come up with a city-wide management plan. They've only, at the moment, about 30% of the city is engaged in this kind of recycling activity, highly localized.
And I think just to conclude with that is that Swachh Bharat has, it might have many faults, but one thing that I did succeed in doing, and there were other plans before that with the Mridula Ramesh and others, but the Swachh Bharat really put waste and sanitation on the agenda, and it rendered that people are more aware of the problems now. Now the next step is setting the infrastructure and making those people who are charged with recycling, those disenfranchised, those oppressed, landless laborers, Dalits, that they have certain returns, financial returns, also social and dignity, so that they can actually deal with this enormous waste when India is trying to redefine its relationship to waste in this 21st century.